Hello and welcome everybody to another very special presentation. I have with me Bob Smith and Mark Stavish once again on the topic of moral relativism, and we're all fired up and ready to go. So first of all, I'm going to say a big thank you to the violetflamestudios.co.nz studio for sponsoring this month's live streaming software. Very grateful to the team there. Please go and check out their amazing website and you can see the progress of the game and other digital educational entertainment products in development that are all born from the desire to share the principles of esoteric philosophy and cosmic actuality for the benefit of humans and beyond. Thank you so much to violetflamestudios.co.nz. Please check them out. Now I'm going to shift right along here. Okay, and I'm going to bring on, first of all, Mr. Bob Stavish. Hello, sorry, Bob Stavish. Oh my gosh, I got too much going on. Bob Smith from 60 Skills. How are you, sir?
I am doing just fine. How are you doing?
I'm great, and I'm so much better for having you here. What's happening in the world of 60 Skills right now?
A lot of good stuff. We started to get our marketing out, so now more people are hearing about us and what we do, and that's awesome. Been having a lot of new people show up to the weekend transmissions. That's great. Been getting a little bit of progress done on the upcoming Zodiac course, which just for people out there to know, there's going to be an advanced and a basic version of the course. The basic version of the course will be something anyone can do, even with no background in IIH or the 60 Skills curriculum. So it's a nice segue into that. My suspicion is the Eleusinian mysteries were probably heavily grounded in this practice originally. And it makes for a very nice jumping off point into spirit magic that is also very safe and very practical for most people. So good stuff coming down the pipe. And of course, there'll be an advanced version of the course for people who've gone through the other coursework and all that other kind of stuff. But that's the big exciting news that's out there right now.
Wonderful, thank you, and that's great. I appreciate the angle that you use when approaching these conversations. Very much a grounded conversation, very relatable, very easy to understand, very succinct. And I also want to just do a big shout out, congratulations to you on your YouTube channel reaching 2,000 subscribers. Well done, sir. I know that you put a lot of time and effort into researching time efficient strategies for YouTube, and you're so generous with sharing on so many different topics. You're so knowledgeable. So I'm really loving these shorts that are coming out. They just get me all sort of teased up and excited. So really looking forward to see where that goes. So congratulations and well done, man.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Much appreciated.
No worries. All right. Well, let's bring on now Mr. Mark Stavish. And I'll get it right this time. Hello, Mark. How are you, sir?
Hello. How's it going? Thank you very much for being inviting me here.
Well, you're always welcome. And you've got I've managed to bring up the Teachable website here, so you can give us a bit of a download as to what's going on and what's available through your service and offerings.
Well, we've got several dozen courses that you can take individually or as part of a program. We do have a integrated program for the Teachable courses. Some of them can be as short as a few hours. Others are multiple week-long classes. And we have some upcoming classes that are hopefully going to be of interest to folks on Julius Evola. Of course, he's a bit of a controversial figure over the last few years. And he went from being unknown to controversial in a matter of a few years. And he is dramatically misinterpreted and understood. In fact, many of the people who are saying controversial and inaccurate things about him have never read him. Now, that doesn't mean he's someone who you just want to take whole cloth, but you want to really examine the ideas that he presents, because some of them are quite fascinating, and some of them are even very useful to us today in our current situation, because we're looking at a man who went through the most tumultuous period of the 20th century. World War I, influenza, the Great Depression, the collapse of empires, World War II, and the Cold War. So some of the things he has to say are useful. Here at the Institute for Hermetic Studies, we don't believe in throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but looking at things contextually in order to understand them and see what we can learn from them and apply them in our own lives.
That for me is the beautiful nutshell of the entry point into the trivium of dispassionately exposing oneself to knowledge and not discarding it because it makes you feel bad. It's like going, where is the value that can be extracted when I sit with this information? And this is one of the reasons of the topic that we're going to be talking about today is that it's largely I was prompted to sort of like reach out to you gentlemen about this topic of moral relativism because it ended up being mentioned on a very prolific YouTuber's entertainment reviewing channel. And so it's sort of hot in the ears of the public, I would like to think. Maybe it's died off a bit, but, there is a value in exploring challenging topics, I think. And there is, I've only just been exposed to Mr. Evola through some information that you've sent me, Mark, and I have been reading through it. And I must say, there is certainly some things in there that I am unsure about, but there are some things in there with some great resonance as well. So I'm very grateful for you sharing that with me. And obviously, in the spirit of Mr. Evola, in some ways, we're going to dive straight into this topic of moral relativism, which is, well, we sort of like came up with a little bit of a plan prior to the chat, and I'm going to just bring up Mr. Bob Smith here to give his take on what is moral relativism.
Well, that question appears to be a big part of the problem. I mean, depending upon who you ask, one of the better definitions of moral relativism is that ultimately there is no right and wrong, there is no good and evil. There are just societal and cultural judgments on these things. And so if everything is relative, ultimately, then in theory, you're pretty much free to do whatever the hell you want. All right. That's an interesting statement. And before I get into my informative aspect involving metaphysics, I do want to clarify that all of the moral relativists that I've met usually have less than kind motivations behind their moral relativism. They're usually using it as a cover to treat others poorly. Now, maybe that's just because I deal with a bunch of bad people. But again, categorizing people as good or bad, according to a moral relativist, has no meaning anyway. All right, fair enough. What I will say is this. Mechanically involving metaphysics, particularly once you begin to impact it on the energetic level, okay, there appears to be a logic and a series of rules governing particularly human behavior in the phenomenal universe. One of the things that I talk about is if a magician abuses the use of Akasha routinely enough, when they die, they don't go through the normal reincarnation process. Instead, they get thrown into the penalty box on Saturn where they get rehabilitated. Okay. For people who visited Saturn through mental wandering or astral projection or the like, regardless of tradition, they've always referred to it as a place of punishment, and if they're paying attention, a place of rehabilitation. Okay. Then that would seem to indicate that there's some rules behind what gets you sent there, and therefore rules you might want to pay attention to if you want to avoid getting shunted off into that box. Okay, that's an interesting statement. I'm a Western person. We group things through a planetary alignment. Maybe that's just my BS way of categorizing these things. Fair enough. I will posit one other observation. Most of your better magicians throughout history have traditionally been men and occasionally women of great faith. There are very few exceptions to this. As one of my teachers once said, faith underlies Akasha. Akasha underlies your ability to generate esoteric power. No faith, no Akasha. No faith, no power. So in theory, hashtag theory, you could believe in anything. You could be one of these chaos magician guys who believes in Mickey Mouse so intensely that you can get everything to work. And these people, to their credit, can pull off some magical aspects of work that appear to actually function. That said, every true atheist I've ever had who's come through my doors to learn magic has struggled greatly. Why? Because they generally can't generate much Akasha. They don't believe in anything. Now, this isn't the same thing as an agnostic. It's fair to say, I don't know. That's okay. But I can tell you the difference in the level of ability, particularly in the beginning stages, between my students who are men and women of great faith and those who are not, is striking. So, again, where you fall on this moral relativism stand is interesting as an individual, but there appear to be some ground rules behind how we comport ourselves, and these definitely impact our ability to engage with the universe. And also, as anyone who's ever been involved in evocation will tell you, there are definitely some things out there that are full of evil intent and that do not benefit anybody to engage with. So, us in the Hermetics realm tend to refer to them as demons. Fair enough. But if you've been involved in the evocation game long enough, everybody ends up running into these things. And it's not a matter of personal observation regarding whether or not they're going to intend to harm you or not. It's in their nature. So, is that good enough as kind of an opening to the conversation, Phil? Or
Well, I appreciate that because you covered a lot of ground there. So that'll make a wonderful little clip to share afterwards. Thank you, sir. I appreciate that encapsulation. Now, Mr. Mark Stavish, I'm fairly confident you have a response for this. Oh, your microphone's off.
Yeah, moral relativism is essentially a reality. Things are relative to our perspective, and they are relative to our intent. Therefore, the demon which wants to eat you sees that as a good. Now, you personally may not. Tough on you. Particularly tough on you if you were stupid enough to really not understand that. However, if we look at what is an absolute law, and I don't like that term too much, or rule, we see that the only thing which is absolute is karma, or cause and effect, cause and result. This gets tricky because it involves a lot of relativism. We see that that which is considered good or bad is relative to one's intention as well as the outcome. But it doesn't mean there aren't consequences, and there aren't things that have to be reconciled. And I think reconciliation we can think in terms as an energetic balancing. Really, when we look at karma or cause and effect, cause and result, and being free of it, we're talking about is being free of habits or habituated patterns. Being able to act freely with insight and wisdom to know the consequences of our actions. So clearly, since there is some kind of consequence, which we do not know, and then that consequence comes back for us to realize it, that is, as you sow, so shall you reap, that somewhere along the line, there is and I don't like this idea either, but I have to use the word, some kind of goal or built-in mechanism aimed at some level of self-realization. That we just can't go around doing whatever we want without there being consequences back on us. So while we can say there's moral relativism, yes, and particularly in the state of duality which we exist, at the same time, and even in that sense of unity, the focus of this causation and effect is the key point. Because true moral relativists don't believe there's going to be any consequences they have to atone for. They believe they really can do whatever they want, that there are no consequences for them. really for anyone, otherwise others would do it, but they think only of themselves, which goes to the other point. Most of the time when we're dealing with moral relativism, we're dealing with people who are fundamentally looking out for what they believe to be their own best interests. We would call that selfish, because it may not be their best interest. They just think it is. So you look at someone who's a criminal. You look at someone who is borderline criminal, or someone who's just difficult to be with, all the way up the line to pathological, sociopath, or what we would call a demon. They're thinking only of themselves and what their actions will do to fulfill their desires and aspirations. They're not thinking of any negative consequences for you, and they're certainly not believing that there's any negative consequences that will happen that they can't avoid. Now, that's really important to understand. So you can have moral relativism and still deal with karma, but you have to understand then, what am I trying to achieve here? What is the purpose of my action? The actions have to become more insightful. They're more informed from a long-term understanding that whatever I do, I'm going to have to be responsible for. So it is relative, but it's not without consequences. Most of the philosophical impact that we talk about, or that Bob has mentioned, is people who just, they don't think there are any consequences.
Wonderful. Thank you. Yes. My understanding is that moral relativism is not really a metaphysically robust sort of concept. If one chooses to embody a spiritual path, then it's like, there is a cause and effect principle at play. And if you don't observe that, then, woe is you, essentially, because you basically it's almost akin to saying, we use this a bit in conversation, it's like, gravity doesn't need you to believe in it, no matter what anyone tells you. And, there's certain laws that we're subject to, and they can affect our ascension, essentially. And, this comes up quite a bit now, especially with the entertainment industry tending to point towards a certain way of thinking and popularizing a way of thinking. And the particular prompt that prompted me to contact you two gentlemen was on this latest episode of Disney Star Wars, where essentially the Jedi are now the bad guys. And, essentially there was a line in the movie that went something along the lines of, it's not about good and evil anymore, it's about power. And so it steers away saying, these things they're not important to consider. It's more about who's got the biggest stick almost. And it's almost like a confusing angle, but the public are going to get that message even at a subconscious level and go, okay, well, I'm curious about popular culture and about how it steers decisions amongst people in society, because if they see something like a multi-hundred million billion-dollar studio presenting certain ideas and framing them away in a traditional intellectual property that is usually something that is quite safe to put the kids in front of, and now it's like you wouldn't use it as a babysitter. These are important because these affect things in my immediate sphere of influence. People are talking about these things going, bro, the Jedi are the bad guys now, I don't know if I can trust this conversation. And so I'm wandering off the topic here, but essentially, elaborating on what is moral relativism. Thank you, gentlemen. What I want to do now is I want to just bring in some contrasting questions to sort of help us separate, because there's a usual bunch of counterpoint questions that pop up when this conversation comes up, and we could go on about them. But Mark shared a wonderful article that we will get to in a moment. But here's a very simplified question, and we have kind of covered it, but maybe there could be an example that one of us could share. And that is, can right and wrong be objectively quantified? Can right and wrong decisions, whether they're at a mental, astral, or even a physical deployment level, be objectively observed in the physical world? When we're making choices, and if everyone's got a moral relativistic attitude, where is that heading, and how can that be observed in the phenomenal world? Bob, are you able to share something on this?
Sure. If you use magic to harm someone else, the issue of backlash is always there. I don't care how clear your intention is. I don't care how many wards you put up. I don't care how dispassionately you do it. Backlash is a real problem. And maybe it's worse. Maybe it's better. But the best example I can use was from a study, and people out there can find that, on psychic warfare during the Soviet Union period. And ultimately, the Soviets abandoned that approach to things because when they had their psychics attempt to harm people by, say, stopping their heart or doing things like this, the psychics eventually all went crazy. And so they quit doing those things because it was too expensive to train up somebody and get them to that point, only to have them break shortly thereafter. And again, the Soviets were about as amoral a group of human beings as you're going to find. I mean, it's not a stretch to call them evil in many respects. So even if they said, hey, using this stuff to harm others isn't worth it, well, that would seem to be a pretty objective standard for right and wrong. And anybody who's ever used magic to smite somebody else, even if they were completely justified in their own view of that, will tell you they've had problems as a result of it. I mean, one example I've used before in some of these other discussions is, I used one of the less spicy entities from the Lemegeton to engage in some demonic powered debt collection. A bunch of deadbeats owed a friend of mine a whole lot of money from a business enterprise, and they weren't paying. Eventually, the blowback on that got to be too much, and I had to stop. Now, my friend got about half his money back after the better part of a year of nobody paying him, so, functionally it worked. Okay. But it became very uncomfortable very quickly on my end, and these were people who all objectively owed my friend quite a bit of money. Now, maybe some of them just didn't have it. That happens in business. People go bankrupt all the time. But the fact that I was doing something that many would view as completely justified, I wasn't using lethal force. If anything, I was just kind of irritating them into writing a check. If that became too uncomfortable to continue on with in a matter of a couple of weeks, if I'd engaged in something spicier, I think it's safe to say I would have quit a lot sooner. Is that an objective reality? I don't know. It meshes pretty well with everyone else I've ever heard who's tried to do this kind of thing. You tell me.
Yeah. So, the metaphysical measuring stick to test out the cause and effect law, these things tend on the side of subtlety and nuance, but it doesn't mean they are not perceivable or detectable depending on one's level of sort of capability. But Mr. Mark Stavish, have you got a response for this?
Well, I don't really like the terms right and wrong, and I don't believe that it can be quantified. What we can quantify is outcomes. And right and wrong is going to be based upon what is your outcome, what is the goal that you have for yourself. And if the goal that you have for yourself is, I don't know, we'll say enlightenment or spiritual illumination, then right and wrong is going to be relative to what you need to achieve those. Now, if your goal is simply the acquisition of power, and I know a lot of magicians, that's what we call it, sorcery. They're really not concerned about enlightenment or insight. They're not concerned about, they've got some vague idea of reincarnation in future lives, but they don't really think a lot about it. Their notion is, I want acquisition of power to achieve XYZ results. So what is going to be good for them, and we put that maybe in air quotes, is going to be those things which supply them with that acquisition of power. Now, that acquisition may go south on them, They may end up having consequences to that which were unintended. They just didn't think about any of those things. That's where the old Saturn penalty box comes in. Except instead of the penalty box, you put it, the whistle comes down and maybe you get a flag or something. You get some early warning signs. So what are the outcomes that you're after? That's really what decides whether an action is right or wrong, because either the outcome is being achieved or the outcome isn't. And in this domain, that is, we're going to say this metaphysical domain, that has to do with your inner state of awakening, your inner state of well-being, your inner state of relationships to others, and we could say general peacefulness, character development. We could call your general virtues. In fact, we would say that the word virtues also is distinctly related to virility or power itself. So the more virtuous you are, the more power you have in classical initiatic systems. And those systems recognize that there are limits, that even if you have massive amounts of power and you have to defend yourself, your family, your state, your nation, your city, that there are still limits on what you can do. So let's focus then, if we want to understand right and wrong, let's skip and say, what is I'm after here? What is it I really want? Now, once this happens, it has to work in and through me, and I'll be the recipient of this effect on some level. Am I okay with that? Am I comfortable with that? When most people think about it, they really come to the conclusion that they're not really comfortable with a lot of the things they would like. That's why a lot of their magic never comes to fruition, because they don't develop the mental fortitude to make it happen, because they're really afraid, and rightfully so, of the consequences if they do, because they're not emotionally mature enough to make the right decisions. And there, I use the word right, but those decisions which aren't going to be harmful to them in the long run. Mm. So there you have it. We both have both sides of the coin. Yes, it's relative, and at the same time, it's all your choice. What do you want for yourself in the end?
So if we replace the words right and wrong with correct and incorrect in regards to what's the right way of doing something, what's the correct way of doing something, and presuming that the correctness involves a preference for not hurting others or hindering them on their path, because my understanding is that when we sort of stop other people from expressing their free will to an extent, I mean, is presuming they're not also aiming to hurt others or something like this, then we can detriment our own development, or basically put roadblocks or karmic responses, stack them up in the future for us to experience at some point. And so when we make choices, if we're aware of, say, just as a loose example, the 7 Hermetic principles, and if we go, well, I'm going to basically, give this concept of universal lawfulness the bird, and go, I can do whatever I want and there's no consequence. I think that can breed almost like a secondary psychopathy or a sociopathic sort of nature as well. And, I'm almost concerned that, this kind of relativistic attitude is, being wholesale pumped into sort of like foundational level societal kind of models of education and that, because essentially we're raising a bunch of people that aren't really going to give a shit about things because they're told it doesn't matter. And this is critical in moving forward, because basically we're setting ourselves up for a loss in the long run. My 2 cents on that one. But I've got another question here or another topic to bring up just to highlight some contrast here. Now, this one here was brought up by someone on a talk I listened to a while back, and that is about the difference between the standards that different levels of consciousness are held to on this planet, or sentience may be a better option of a word. are animals or lesser beings not the best, but are they held to the same standards as humans in regards to, cause and effect, things like that? They're obviously more instinctual. We have a level of decision making available to us that we presumably and ostensibly they don't have access to. And so, as God's favored, some might say, it's like, well, we get more options, but we've got more skin in the game as well. And so we're held, there's more whoopsies for us essentially if we don't get taught right. And so, yeah, I'd love to hear your gentleman's response on this. Bob, would you like to start?
Sure. Well, on a basic level, wherever animals go and wherever humans go after they die appear to be two different places. Nobody's exactly sure why this is. Some people posit that animals don't ultimately have consciousness, so when they die, they just revert to the elements, and human beings don't. I have no idea if that's true or not, but that's some of the discussions you get into in that. That said, when we die, I haven't run into any of the animals that I ever raised or grew up with in my mental wandering who were already dead. So this is somewhat curious. Now, some Native American faiths talk about spirit animals that exist in the subtle planes. Sometimes you can interact with those. But again, is that the spirit of a deceased animal, or is that just an entity that chose to take on that shape? Brother, I got a bunch of clues and none of them are good. So, as far as that's concerned. But ultimately, my suspicion is no. And I say this because I will use the example of the mentally retarded or the mentally ill. In most evolved justice systems, if someone's severely mentally ill, they're not considered responsible for their behavior. Likewise, if somebody suffers from a severe case of mental retardation, whether from birth or brain damage or whatnot, that same standard is usually applied. Hey, this guy simply didn't realize what he was doing. Now, that's not to say that we won't take those individuals and remove them from general society so they can't hurt other people. Okay, that's a separate issue. But there seems to be a near universal understanding that if you're not capable of true cognition, then we're not going to hold you accountable in the way we would most other human beings. People, particularly in the New Age movement, like to make a big deal about how beautiful nature is. Okay. Nature's horrible. Nature is vicious on a level that most people just really don't understand. There's a great Joe Rogan episode where they found a clip of a grizzly bear, a brown bear, killing a deer. And it was literally this animal cornering another animal and mauling it to pieces and eating it while it's still alive. And you hear the deer screaming and everything else. But the bear doesn't survive unless it does this, if not every day, with great frequency. All right, if I walked down the street and mauled one of my neighbors to pieces and ate him while he was still alive, most people would consider that to be evil, and for good reason. We don't consider the brown grizzly bear eating a deer to be evil. So, again, I would argue, that animals are held to a different standard because they're not completely in control of what they do. Likewise, when humans are not in control of what they do, we tend to treat that a little bit differently. A big one's drunk driving. Only recently would you go to prison for killing somebody while drunk driving. 30, 40, 50 years ago, you might have paid a big fine. You might have done a couple weeks in county or a couple months in county, but you weren't going to spend the next 20 years in prison for that. Why? Well, he was drunk. He wasn't in control of himself. Now, society's vision of this has evolved for the most part. But I'm here to tell you, in a lot of places where they don't have a lot of law enforcement, that older view of how this gets dealt with is pretty common. I mean, one of the reasons why driving in Thailand is so incredibly dangerous, they have the, depending upon which group you consult with, the second most dangerous roads on the face of the planet, next to Libya, is the locals like to party and they like to drive. So if you're on the road after dark on a Friday or Saturday night, you might want to consider getting off the road. Now, this whole Buddhist vision of fatalism plays into that a little bit. You know, if I get in an accident and die, it's karma. I think that's a cop-out, but that's an argument that you will hear from time to time. So, yeah, man, it's interesting. But ultimately, I haven't seen anything that suggests that animals are held to the same standards as human beings are, simply because they're not capable of doing so. And, you know, if you talk to a evolutionary biologist, they'll tell you an animal is only as smart as the thing it feeds on. So, you know, deer, they feed on grass. You don't have to be too smart to feed on grass. If you're a tiger, on the other hand, that tiger has to chase things down. The tiger's a pretty smart animal. I don't understand the setup of the universe where you would penalize an entity for evolving that way. That makes no sense. So all tigers are evil and all deer are good. Well, the deer is still killing the grass. The grass probably isn't super happy about that. So anyway, ultimately, no, I don't think they're held to the same standards.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that. I think that there's a grace period for those who are not yet aware of that. I think that there's a bit of a you could separate it into sort of ignorance, and not as a derogatory thing, but people are ignorant that the information's there, but they haven't exposed themselves to it. And then there's nescience, where people are that the information is not available, and that is they may not even be capable of taking that on and then operating from that understanding once they have developed it as well. And so animals, whatever they're driven by, instinct and carnal or lower urges, you know, for survival. Yeah, I tend to agree with that. Mr. Mark Stavish, have you got a comment on this?
No, it's just fundamentally what he said. And to give an example of that, there's a difference between being naive and stupid.
Yep.
And stupid is when you're naive and you refuse to begin to understand how the world works. And not just in some cynical notion of, well, that's the way the world is, but I'm talking in the cosmic sense, in the sense of what is it? What are the fundamental working mechanisms underlying this visible and invisible interaction that we have? And the problem is that the terror of apparent reality, when you realize this is broken, it doesn't work, that's and you say, I don't know what to do now, that's too much for me to wrap my head around, I got to go hide. There's a consequence to that karmically, because that burden of knowing is like what cannot be undone. So that's why you see certain general guiding principles that are often stated in different hermetic groups and occult lodges about public demonstrations and principles. You know, one of them is that, you know, you can only do 1 or 2 public demonstrations a year, and generally those are within a closed group of students who will benefit from that. That doing public demonstrations are problematic because once you've and I use the phrase have torn the veil or pulled back the veil for someone, now they are responsible for that knowledge. They're responsible for that, and you are now responsible for making them responsible. Whereas had they just gone on their own way, like it or not, their habituated patterns or karma would have maybe brought them to the path sooner or later. But that's not for you to decide. It also may not be for you to demonstrate, again, in public. That's why most of the demonstrations that I'm familiar with were done in private. I never encountered anyone or anything like a Sai Baba, producing ash or jewels or pakoras, in public. Now, of course, he was doing it mostly among his devotees, but that's, still a very fascinating series of demonstrations. Believe them or not, that's up to you. So the karmic consequences that we have are based upon our knowledge, our level of function and action. So it's not possible for an animal to be held to the same level as us. It would be a terribly unjust universe if that were the case.
It might not even work properly, it could be a software upgrade is required. Perhaps this has existed in the past, but if we're aware, if we know we're doing the wrong thing and we go ahead and do it anyway, I think another great sort of way to sort of explore the contrast of this is like, imbibing alcohol. I don't, but I did. I've got to say, most of the worst decisions that I've made in my life have been under the influence of alcohol in the past, and the way that skews your moral compass and your ability to make sound judgment, especially in regards to how it affects others. Watching, working with children and seeing how impressionable they are and how easy it is to affect their decision making, or how they see the world. They look up to people, and I've seen how they idolize people. I saw a young guy I was teaching. He didn't want to be a guitar lesson, but when the PE teacher came in, who's this, glorified member of the school staff, the kid's looking at him with these huge eyes going, man, he's a god, or, I idolize this guy. And it's like, man, I don't have the level of influence on this guy, but, this guy here recognizes that he carries a lot of weight. And so you don't want to be steering people wrong. So, yeah, I mean, thank you for bringing that up, Mark. When you share information with people, there's a responsibility, I think this is in and of itself is a really valuable concept for people to consider before they just sort of lavishly throw themselves at people. I mean, with esoteric knowledge, especially, there's probably a good way to do it and a not so good way, because you don't want to hinder yourself unnecessarily, your own personal progress as well. It might sound a bit selfish, but at the end of the day, you're the one that has to pay the piper for whatever's going on. And so there seems to be I don't know, how fine is the line, guys? Is this how do we operate in this world? I mean, I refer back to Jesus and how he operated, and he was going out to the places, and he was, would he have got the traction he got if he wasn't giving demonstrations of metaphysical skillfulness? Would he have been attracting the attention and the ears, and that if he hadn't have done those things? And is that part of the price that he ultimately paid? I mean, sorry if we're wandering off the topic here, but I sort of feel that segues a little.
Well, my great uncle, who had, mentioned this to me when I was quite young, he had said that, the thing with Jesus is that the people at that time expected it.
Mm-hmm.
He wasn't the only guy walking around.
Yeah.
And, as you study theology, and then, of course, when you study religious history, you find out that there are other characters popping around as well. Of course, in the New Testament, we hear of Simon Magus. Of course, he's one. And then we hear of Apollonius later. Outside of that, the Martinists are particularly fond of him, and a lot of Gnostics are. So for him, again, it's relative to the environment you're in and the people you're with. It's not about right or wrong. It's about what is the outcome I'm after, and what is the effective way to get that outcome, and what is the ineffective way to get that outcome.
Yeah.
So, and there's a good possibility that you're right, that part of that demonstrativeness may have played a part in his fate, if you will. But that's another story too, because it's a very theologically loaded
totally
discussion.
Wonderful. Okay, and now here's one that I'm sure that many people who are tuned in, and I just want to say thank you to everyone. If you've got any questions, please throw them into the live chat, and we'll get to them once we've at the top of the hour. But this one here is directly relatable to the individuals out there that are on a path, and we have sort of covered it, but I wanted to address it directly. How is personal spiritual development affected by a worldview that embraces moral relativism? Does it essentially create a point of go no further? Does it impede development, or is it a limited hangout? If you think anything goes, then you may find that next time you incarnate, presuming that's part of your worldview as well, you may end up like downgrading. You're going back from steak back down to sausages. And, it's like, why would you want to do that? Unnecessarily disadvantage your long game. So if I could pass that to Mr. Bob Smith.
Sure. As we spoke about earlier briefly, faith underlies Akasha. Akasha underlies your level of spiritual ability to a very great degree. So those students I've had who were truly atheist struggled to do much of anything at all. You can generate a tiny bit of Akasha through single pointed focus exercises and a few other things. But eventually what happened to all of them is they would reach a breaking point where they realized that their philosophy was inaccurate. And they did either one of two things. They either ran away screaming, never to be seen again, or they had to change their view of the world. Now, not too many of them became, born-again Christians or anything like that, but there was a reality that their prior view of anything goes was certainly not accurate. And those people in particular had a really hard time when it came to evocation. Because generally speaking, if you take the entities out of the mix that are completely negative in nature and you leave them alone, what you get from most non-physical entities has a lot to do with their reflecting off of you. So if your esoteric hygiene isn't very good because you're going around robbing and stealing and lying and doing drugs and abusing your neighbors, that's generally the reflection of an entity you summon that you're going to get. And that's going to be very unpleasant. And lo and behold, as people clean up their spiritual life, those negative interactions decrease and dissipate over time. And it's the reason why when I'm dealing with spirit evocation of my own students, I go, hey, if you just spent a long weekend doing a bunch of wild stuff, probably shouldn't log in Sunday. Might want to take a couple weeks off because your odds of having something bad happening are a lot higher. And the entities know. I mean, you can cloak yourself in as much Akasha and non-dual light as you want. If you've been up to a bunch of shenanigans, the entities are going to know about that. And they're going to show you a picture of their reality based off of that. So that by itself has a huge impediment towards getting anything done in the spiritual realms. Because, as one of my teachers once said, pain is the price of power. How much do you want and how much can you take? Anybody who's ever done an Akashic immersion where you kick on that power of the void and leave it on for a couple weeks or a couple months at a time will describe to you exactly how wearing and jarring that is on them. It takes years to fully recover if you ever do. Now, if you've got some bad lifestyle habits, the stuff hanging out in the void that's attracted to that's going to come out to play when you do that. You know, Cthulhu mythos much?
Hmm.
You know, some of the wackier fiction authors out there. I mean, hell, Stephen King creeps me out whenever I see him on TV, and I like reading his books. So, all I'm getting at is yes, if you embrace moral relativism, it's definitely going to open you up to some things that are not particularly nice on the spiritual level. And it's greatly going to complicate your ability to get anything done until you get over that. That's probably not something a lot of people want to hear, and probably going to cost me some sales and money and all that other kind of stuff. But I've seen that process go full circle too many times to think it's anything other than something by design. So there you go.
Yeah, wonderful. And thank you for sharing, your personal insights in regards to your own practices with your students, and that as direct examples of, if you're going to enter these practices, like I said, why unnecessarily disadvantage yourself, not just to hinder your progress, but set yourself up to have bad experiences, and I think that, these are the teachers that can explain the how and why is what we need, because, here's a thing, go do it. Is there anything else I should know? No, you're sweet. What about lifestyle stuff? No, it's fine. Don't worry about it. It's like, yeah, no. Mr. Mark Stavish, have you got a comment on this? How is personal spiritual development affected by a worldview that embraces moral relativism?
Everything works in and through us. Therefore, when we engage in any of these practices, we will encounter what was previously referred to in the late 19th, early 20th century as the terror of the threshold, or the guardian of the threshold. And that guardian is the summation of our psyche. We turn inward. We're no longer looking outward, even if we're doing techniques that somehow involve an outward gaze or support. But in truth, what happens is our awareness becomes more inward, and we see the summation of our psyche. And if we respond to that with great joy, we can have some light. If not, we often have the terror reality. So, and then we have to decide if we're going to go further or not. Some people have that experience. It terrifies them because it opens them up to, again, views of themselves and the cosmos, even if it's just very small, by the way, not vast and overwhelming, but it appears that way. And they say, I'm not going back there. That's crazy, too much. Can't handle that. It's scary. Or they suck it up and they go back for more, and they become to understand that terror they are experiencing is, again, a reflection of their own psyche, of their own summation, if you will, distillation of who they are, and that now they have to decide how they're going to calcine and distill that essence of their being so that they can get all the muck out and refine it, purify it, refine it, make it stronger, make it clearer. What do we mean clearer? A clearer mechanism. If I have a cup, I don't want to put the dirty cup. I don't want to put clean water in it. And if I have a dirty window, it certainly is going to obscure my ability to look outside. So as we clean the window of our psyche, as we purify it, we strengthen it, we're able to handle reality in small ways better and better. And that is a increasing often of our inner power or virtues and virility. And those virtues have what we call moral or ethical considerations, such as Don't steal. No. I know that you think it's really a great idea to take books that are already in print and whose authors are still alive and make them available on your server somewhere for the path, for the good of human enlightenment. But that's not your responsibility or right to do. Mainly because the people are still alive and you didn't ask them. There's a whole lot of questions there. Don't lie. If you don't know something, say, I don't know. If you're wrong, oh, okay, I was in error. Don't go around being libelous and slanderous. There's a host of esoteric authors who have demonstrated their true capacity over the last 4 years, 5 years. By the way, they've treated a lot of other people who they disagreed with. Not on esoteric matters, but on political matters of all things. And the way they did it was truly unethical and immoral. Same thing with generosity. Be generous. Don't be stingy. Now, that doesn't mean to be foolish, but a lot of our folks are, quite frankly, tighter than 2 coats of paint. Therefore, they think it's okay to steal stuff. Therefore, they're always viewing themselves as wanting things for free or cheap because they don't really trust it, because they don't really committed to it, because they're not really going to do it. So they don't want to put much into it, but they want you to hold their hand and tell them what a great person they are because they're on this path a little bit. No, get in. Get all in. You do you good. Does you great. Get all in because now you got skin in the game and you're going to make a serious effort. And what that means is you have faith. Faith meaning some confidence. You have some confidence in your ability to get this done. You don't know what it is. You're open to all the possibilities. It's a big, wide, wonderful world out there, and you don't know what's going to happen. But you have faith that you can do this and manage it, and something wonderful, or we'll use good, is going to happen for you that's going to get this cycle moving where you can improve the quality of your existence. That's all part of this virtuous, ethical, moral aspect. But if you believe that I shouldn't have to pay for this, well, that's fine. Go to the library. Go to interlibrary loan. There's wonderful things there. Institute for Medic Studies is involved in making a transfer of it, starting with at least 250 academic titles and others to a major research university in northeastern Pennsylvania. We've already got the negotiations underway, and it's probably going to be closer to 1,000 when we're done.
Oh, well done.
So there's books there. There's good stuff. We may even throw in a copy of Barden's Initiation in Hermetics into the mix.
Sure.
Okay, so, well, I'm not talking about that. They don't want to do that. Not everyone, but a lot don't. They don't want to explore the options available to them. That's laziness, by the way. And that's not a virtue. But then that comes into that kind of relative moral relativism where they kind of make excuses for it.
Mm-hmm.
So again, I don't think in terms of right and wrong. I think in terms of outcomes. What are the outcomes you want for yourself, for your life, and what do you need to do to get it? And then if you undertake this action, what will the results be? If you undertake this action, what will the results be? If you undertake this one. Now choose wisely and pick the actions that have the best effect for you. And usually you'll find out, not always, but often, those are the ones that have the best impact for those around you, that make you most useful to other people on some level, that improve your ability to be of assistance to others. And that generally makes the world a better place. Maybe not by turning it into a utopia, but at least maybe your family and your neighborhood. You might even find you have the ability to stop complaining about things and maybe run a successful business or run for public office and win, and then deal with what really goes on the inside, or to serve on a nonprofit board, or to raise money for nonprofit entities that need it. But that power only happens when you are committed to your outcome of self-awareness and self-development, and actualizing through action. And moral relativism usually is a method of just walking away from that, even if it's just creeping into the darkness.
Thank you for that. You raised a wonderful point before. It reminded me of a phrase I heard, which is to build a vessel worthy of spirit to indwell. And so if we've got a dirty vessel, then like you said, that's going to sort of color what we see and also drive decision making. So we've got to attend to these layers of reality, like we do in the Hermetic system. And I have to say that discovering metaphysics and seeking to understand universal lawfulness and how actual it is by having testable methods has been very satisfying, because otherwise I just find that it's just a whole bunch of people talking a whole bunch of flowery speculation that goes nowhere, and I just find it to be rather unhelpful to sharing the good word. And having faith pays off, like Bob said, like it really does. I was a little bit too cold against the idea, and then I started just opening up a little bit, and I have to say, wonderful things started to appear, and it started to change the way I viewed the world. And like you said, Mark, I think that the outside world is a wonderful reflection. How well are those around us doing? And
let me just say something that
sure,
some people aren't good for faith. It's not in their temperament. However, I have a student, wonderful, smart young woman from Baltimore, very successful. And she said, I just have trouble having faith. I said, well, that's fine. She said, what are you having faith in? And I said, ultimately, you're having faith in yourself. You're having faith in yourself that you can undertake this practice and this process, and that you can trust your own judgment about what's happening as a result of it. See, ultimately, it's faith in yourself. It's confidence in your capacity. Now, that will grow in time, and that becomes your notion of self changes and becomes broader and more inclusive. And as we say, it involves that, what we call the spiritual dynamic or the soul dynamic. Again, I'm not a big fan of these words, but it's just another way of saying it grows and becomes more complete. And in that completeness, more powerful. Some people don't have that problem. Theirs is the other. They're always putting faith in something external to them. It's always externalized. A good place is somewhere in the middle to learn to move back and forth. Have faith in yourself and confidence, and also recognizing faith in maybe the bigger machinery out there, the bigger mechanisms. That's the key. If you don't, I have a small card in front of me. It was sent out by Amwork decades ago. I grew up around them. My grandmother had one on her mirror. My great uncle had them, and it says, "Cosmic law fulfills." Karma, as the Lamas say, karma is inexorable. It's going to happen, and when you really accept that in a joyful way, that's faith. Karma is going to happen. That's faith. Do it joyfully. Cosmic law fulfills. It's going to happen joyfully.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you. Okay, so I've got another thing here once again to give some real world relatability to the topic of conversation, and that is, we'll start with Bob. What examples from history can help us to understand how morality affects the evolution and decline of society? So I'll just pass this to you, sir.
Yeah, I mean, listen, this is one we've talked about before, Mark and I, is this issue of terminal demographics. For, 70, 80 years now, a segment of academia and intelligentsia has been telling people, the world's overpopulated, have less children. Okay. People eventually started taking up that worldview. The yen has now collapsed from about 100 to the US dollar to about 160. It's probably going to get worse. Why? They're running out of Japanese people. The Germans may or may not be able to field an army to confront the Russians because they don't have any young people. Okay, you wanted less people, but you're going to get less stuff and less money and less capability to go along with it. Hey, all this great new advanced technology, fusion power, electric cars, blah, 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 blah. All right. Data centers. These are all capital intensive endeavors. But if you don't have any people, you don't have any capital. What of these things are we just not going to do because we run out of the stuff to do it with? And oh, by the way, this isn't a new phenomenon. People forget, and I've used this example before, Christianity took over Western Europe because the pagans quit having children. Infanticide was such a common practice that the first orphanages that weren't devoted to military personnel's families didn't exist in Western Europe until 1200 AD. It literally took the church 800 years of telling the Europeans, you're not allowed to murder your unwanted children, until they stopped doing it in big enough numbers to actually have an orphanage. If you're a huge fan of paganism, maybe you should have some more kids so that worldview becomes a more predominant one. Yeah, that isn't going to happen, and we all know why.
Yeah.
But yeah, man, all that stuff is downstream of how a society is structured. If you don't believe in truth, if you don't believe in beauty, if you don't believe in property ownership, well, then all the things that come from that, this sublime combination of Hellenistic thought and Judeo-Christian morality that is Western civilization, you don't get that. You get something else. And a lot of the other stuff that's out there is pretty damn ugly. You know, I've lived in pre-industrial societies. I've lived in non-Western societies. I've lived in thoroughly socialist societies. They all suck. They're all terrible. They're just horrible. You know, you don't get to have, equal rights for women in, traditional pagan Greece. You know, you don't get to have, how do I say this, fair treatment of others when you can enslave a man, castrate him so he's a little more docile to work with, and then kill him when he gets old. That's part of your worldview. How are you going to treat other human beings? And we've got actual historical examples of these things. So yeah, man, it's evolution and decline of society or its advancement is definitely downstream of its morality. And people who want to pretend otherwise are going to be in for a really rude awakening. I mean, right now, worldwide, if you look at people who are having children at greater than replacement rate, 2.1 per family, nuclear family, they're all religious.
Yeah.
80 years from now, unless something really weird happens, and I see nothing on the horizon that's going to change that, we are going to have a much more deeply religious world because those are the only people who are actually having kids. Mark, I think you could say a whole lot more about this than I could. But
well, I could say a couple of things. Contemporary neo-paganism is fundamentally not family-friendly for the most part. But that's another story for another time because that has possibilities of changing. The notion of relativity is we're talking about, again, we don't even need to look to history. We just need to look to current events. We are no longer a nation of laws. We haven't probably been a nation of laws for, I don't know, maybe 5 years, 8 years, maybe 10. But it's really apparent now that we're no longer a nation of laws because we got 30 million or more illegal aliens in the country. Now, like it or not, they're illegal. You may not like them, they may be your friends or your neighbors. But I know 2 guys who couldn't get in here legally. They crossed the border, they flew to Paris, flew to Mexico City, crossed the border, surrendered to border agents within 2 hours, then they were in Jersey. They now have driver's licenses and social security numbers and can vote. So if you were a native born citizen or went through the citizenship test, you're the fool. System doesn't work. And the people who tell you it does are liars because they don't believe it, because they're operating from some function of moral relativity. Well, so that's it. You don't have to look to history. So when a society does not follow the rule, does not believe that law matters, or when at least the core part of that society, which in this case will be what's left of the middle class, that society will collapse. And it will collapse violently, and it will collapse with a great deal of bloodshed. It may not all at once. It never happens all at once. But it leads to that. And a great deal of oppression. Because you didn't want to play by the rules. You didn't believe rules mattered. So what you get then is the American Caesar or some variation of National Socialism, because those only exist when there's a vacuum in power. And there's only a vacuum in power when there's a vacuum in ethics and morality. It's not complicated. Yeah. Now, in terms of the future being more conservative, I've said that for a while because they're the only ones thinking to conserve or preserve. Institute's been around for 25 years now. For the last 7 or 8, we've been actively raising money for the preservation of various esoteric texts and teachings. We've done okay with that. We have not been able to partner with any of the local regional organizations at all. None of them. None of them have the vision or the capacity or the desire. They're all looking for us to provide them with money and resources without bringing anything else to the table. And they don't have anything to offer. So even building space isn't secure. So when we were able to enter into discussions with several people, or organizations, when we looked at the facility offerings, even if the facility offerings were good, long-term stability or capacity was woefully inadequate, meaning that at the end of the year, they were barely in the black. So they were one catastrophe away from collapse. Generally speaking, religious institutions are not, or generally speaking, academic institutions are not a big fan of esoteric collections, as we've talked about in the past. There has been some modest change in that, where there are several organizations that are buying these things up with a vacuum cleaner. Okay. When we did our pitch to several universities several weeks ago, about a month ago, the response was surprising. The one who I had hoped for, but I knew we wouldn't get for a variety of reasons, said no. And it was just a personal reason that I was hoping they'd say yes, purely personal. The best of all possible worlds said yes. We want to see what you've got. They're a Jesuit-run institution. Now, I want that to sink in. A Jesuit-run institution is going to be getting the key parts, or all, of our esoteric library and collection. Why? Because the spiritual people for the last 30 years, 40 years, couldn't think of a future, couldn't plan for one. Now, we have had some people who've helped us. I want to be clear on that. We have had, and we continue to have, and we're going to get more in the future. But it's the difference between saying, I need $500,000 now to get this done, or not. Or what we could have done 10 years ago for even $150,000 is going to be $500,000 now. And it's not that there aren't enough people on our mailing list to raise that. There are. But we're constantly dealing with people who say, oh, I can't do anything. I don't have anything. You don't have $100 a year? You don't have $2 a week? I got 1,500 people on one mailing list. At $100 a year, what's that? Someone tell me.
Sorry, I was monitoring the comments.
Yeah, that's a lot of cash. That solves a lot of problems. So when we look to the future, the irony is esotericism is not going to be preserved by our good liberal friends, our good progressive friends screaming about politics and reducing things to moral relativism. It's not. And I know that because I'm talking to them and I'm talking to the people who are saying yes. I know who's saying no and I know who's saying yes. And the people saying yes have a different view of the world and what needs to be done. And to conserve and preserve means that you've made a decision that this is of value and important to the future. This is the world's wisdom that needs to be preserved. Or as one author who's so well known to you, I won't even mention their name, said to me, I'll be sending you these copies for the collection so that they at least can be on the shelves as long as Western civilization exists, as long as that is. So this is a serious question because we're at a serious point in history. And we're at that serious influx or flux point, if you will, or turning point. And we have choices. And if we make effective choices, not good or bad, not right or wrong, but we make the choices that give us the outcomes we want, then we'll probably get them. So if you want Western esotericism preserved, you've got to make choices that are going to do that. But that goes back to then, as what Bob said, well, believe it or not, that has something to do with people here to do that. Who are the people going to be? Who are the people that are going to be doing that, and how are you going to get them and have them and maintain them and help them and support them? And that has a whole cyclic influence. So I think there's a bit of irony in this. But you know what? It's also cyclic, so it's predictable. So, and I hope that answers the question.
Wonderful. Thank you. We do have some questions in the audience, and some of them are probably, they're quite pointed. So I'll just bring up one here. Now, I'm aware that, we are coming to the end of our time. So I'm flexible with time. And so, gentlemen, if you need to disappear at all, just let me know. But we're going to bring in this one here from Pseudo History. And he's used presumably the person has used the nomenclature of right and wrong, and here is the capital punishment, right or wrong. So this talks basically about capital punishment, obviously, like taking someone's life as deemed, because if there's someone in the village who is going to be a problem and is going to at some point cause problem and hurt someone, do you wait for that to happen, or do you, and this isn't necessarily capital punishment, that's the end result, I guess, once you take this person, but it's a tricky one. I don't know. I'm just going to share this. I have my own views, but we've got a few questions here, so I'll just pass it around. I think that generally speaking, if you're going to be part of a community, then there's an adherence to a set of ways of being, and if you don't like them, then you shouldn't be in that group. Essentially, but that's also needs probably a little bit more context as well. So I'll just pass this over to Bob Smith.
Sure. And again, this goes back to the issue of moral relativism. Hey, listen, as an alumni of the War on Terror and a bunch of other very unpleasant things, I'm here to tell you there are people out there who just want to kill you. They're evil. And they're smart. And they don't care. If you allow this person to run free, they will continue to do bad things. If you lock them into a jail cell, they have an incredible ability to continue to do bad things, even from within a jail cell. Historically, every society has had capital punishment. Now, a big difference between a good society and a bad society is the issue of restraint and use. And listen, people give the Catholic Church any amount of crap over the Inquisition. There were only about 2,500 official executions during a 400-year period of the Inquisition. It's pretty clear the church went out of its way to not execute people. And again, if you're dealing with a child rapist or a serial killer, there's no amount of education that's going to fix these people. There's something fundamentally broken and something fundamentally wrong with them. And keep in mind, when you look at things like the 10 Commandments, it doesn't say thou shalt not kill. It says thou shalt not murder. In other words, kill without reason. So capital punishment, right or wrong? I think depending upon how it's used, it is right. It can certainly be abused in a wrong way by taking a look at things like the Khmer Rouge, or the Cultural Revolution, or the death camps in Western Europe during World War II, or any number of other things. But ultimately, the use of capital punishment isn't wrong in and of itself. It's wrong in how it's applied. Because when properly applied, it's applied to people who will continue to harm others given any chance at all. And oh, by the way, that includes the prison guards you're using to lock them up in the meantime while they're not running around in public doing these things. Now, do you use capital punishment for a kid stealing a bicycle? Clearly not. That's incorrect. But listen, children who are abducted to be sexually abused usually don't live longer than a few days. At best, usually a few hours. I don't have any problem with killing the guy responsible for that. And there aren't many people out there who, when you really corner them on that issue, have a problem with it either. Now, these things are unpleasant. And, we shouldn't be, how do I say this, easygoing in our application of them. But that's the way it works. Again, one of the great crimes of this moral relativistic kind of time period we're in right now is this idea that you can just do whatever you want. No, when you're part of a society, there are demands upon your behavior for being there. And if you don't want to be a part of that club, go someplace else. Because when people believe too differently about things, there will be conflict to determine which view is the one that ends up being embraced by the group. And that view will be enforced upon the group. If you're lucky, they just let you leave. But human beings can't survive on their own either. And nobody likes a free rider. So there you go. Capital punishment, right or wrong? I would say it depends upon its application. And ideally, in a nice, robustly funded society, it should happen fairly rarely. But, the child molester who's going to kidnap a kid off the street and kill him 3 hours later, that guy gets whatever he has coming to him.
Wonderful. Thank you. Mr. Mark Stavish.
I'll just say, what he said. and add, one thing we need for that, though, and I say this quite seriously, is, you need some kind of spirit trap to keep that wretched consciousness from reincarnating. You got to trap it in some kind of nice brass box and, I don't know, play it Lawrence Welk songs for, 20, 30 years till it understands, it's how it needs to behave, or you're going to do it again. But I say that seriously. I mean, I've always wondered about that. We have these terrible people. I've met them. Most of the people I know have never sat across from a table with someone who was a murderer. They just haven't. They don't understand what kind of people are out there. And the idea is that, okay, so we're going to execute them because they do bad things in prison to each other. They do bad things to the guards. I have friends I know quite a few correctional officers. That's a world that most people, again, have no idea. They've never been inside a maximum security prison. They don't know what it smells like. So what do we do with this guy? If we kill him, okay, so what? He smokes out. He goes to a hell realm for a while. We just have to trust the system, right? But if you keep creating a context in which guys like him can come back, because they tend to be men, by the way, but there's women as well. If you keep creating a context where a place where they can reincarnate, where they can gravitate towards an environment that they're familiar and friendly and comfortable with because it's so terrible, then that just kind of perpetuates itself. So you have to clean up the environment too. Or find a way to keep them from reincarnating. And, one of the ways of dealing with spirits or entities, I should say, in the East is that when you bind them, you also have to read them the scripture in order to cultivate them. They don't just stop doing bad things, we'll say, or doing things that are detrimental to their karma and others, but then you have to read them scriptures and give them teachings on truth so they can evolve. I just thought I'd throw that out there for the fun of it. So, next question.
Fair enough. Thank you. Now, here's a good one. Here we go. Here's a good one. Okay, so how can we bring back morality into our country via spiritual work? So this chap here is thinking about his community, his neighborhood, and going, okay, how can I use my practice to bring back morality, I guess, or maybe a better, like you said, Mark, if we're propagating and building if we're not tending to the soil, crappy things are going to grow out of it in the long run. And so, if we're allowing the place to go to crap, the environment is going to be more hospitable to certain types and attract those types. And, there's a wide scale of what is allowed to exist here. And that includes the crummiest of the crummy to the most beautiful of the most beautifulest. And those two ends, there's a scale in between them. And the problem is that when one end, the less favorable end, starts to fatten out and get a bit heavy down the bottom end, it's like going, then we start to have real problems. And this is, one of the arguments, I guess, for having a set of teachings to sort of guide the ethical and moral development of a community is because there's actually a good reason for that, because we have examples from history where we've done this happened, let's not do that again. So back to the question, how, Mr. Bob Smith, how can we bring back morality into our country via spiritual work? However you would like to answer that.
Well, here's the answer most of my New Age brethren don't want to hear. Most religions are a lay people's explanation of someone else's esoteric experience. So if you're not willing to go full monkey the way some of us here are, to where you develop that internal barometer that's reinforced through very unpleasant experiences when you deviate from that,
it's a fine line.
Then you have religion that says, hey, here are some parables. Here are some stories of the lives of the saints. Here are some rules to live by so you don't act like a complete bloody savage. And the people I'm most critical of are, of course, on this note, are the New Agers out there who, as Mark has repeatedly pointed out, throw out the baby with the bathwater. You only get to have these New Age beliefs because you're just a lapsed Christian. You still think and act like a Christian. You just don't go to church. But your grandkids who weren't raised in the church, they're a bunch of animals. Okay. Got it. You know, my favorite discussion of the difference between soldiers in an American army and soldiers in a foreign army is, in an American army, the officers are there to hold the soldiers back.
Yeah.
Not to send them forward. Because if we just turned over the next war to a bunch of sergeants, I guarantee it would be over in about 2.5 weeks. Now, what happened in the meantime, most people wouldn't be very happy with. But it would be over pretty quick. Listen, you know, the pagan world was a horrible, horrible, horrible place. Slavery, castration, human sacrifice. You name it, man. It was a free-for-all. And my favorite example are the people who whine about the conquistadores. The bunch of guys who just got done kicking the Muslims out of Iberia showed up in Mesoamerica in a place where the locals were engaging in human sacrifice on an industrial scale. And their response was the only moral one available. Grab the muskets, grab the torches, we're burning this down. We're just putting an end to this right now. Now, were they the nicest bunch of guys? Of course not.
But Bob, let's be clear on that. They didn't do it alone. The people who were being oppressed said, hey, it's payback time.
We're on board with this.
We're on board with this.
Right. And so that's, you know, ultimately what you're talking about is reestablishing religion. Okay. Establishing a new religion, not the easiest thing to do. The people who do it usually suffer a lot. But I would offer you another alternative. Go to your local school board, get elected. When one of these weirdos tries to, you know, put child porn on the bookshelves for your elementary students, be the guy on the school board who says no. You know, take part in your local politics. You know, again, this can have some ramifications for you in your work life. It's going to take real effort. You're going to have to organize, get together with other people, raise funds, create trust, create associations, probably get sued a few times, maybe lose your job. But that's the real world, which means you got to do real world stuff. And if that isn't enough, I will once again go back to Egregores. As an individual, I can work the biggest, baddest, kick-ass ritual on the face of the planet. Now, given who I am, I might even be able to get 10 or 12 of my best friends together to help me with it. That isn't even a candle wick in a gale storm compared to a political movement of millions of people. I'm not going to move that needle a quarter of a degree compared against the veritable whirlwind of energy and power that's being generated by millions of people thinking one thing. Sorry, my ego's not that big. And if your ego is that big, give it a try and see what happens. Again, if you want to bring morality back, your spiritual work will be your guide regarding what that is, how you choose to engage it. And that's important. I mean, hey, the great fetid saints of human history all came out of exactly this. But it's going to take engaging with the phenomenal physical world in real and vibrant and potentially costly ways for you personally. I mean, listen, the amount of crap I've taken just releasing the coursework that I have, which, by the way, is all derivative. None of the techniques I use are anything new. They've been the same for the last 8,000 years. I'm just a guy who actually put pen to paper and put it down. You know, nobody cares about the hundreds of thousands of dollars spent over 30 plus years going to different ends of the earth, dealing with cult leaders, climbing mountains in Indian Kashmir, almost dying, disease, illness, injury, and everything in between. To put down a bunch of stuff that humankind has known how to do for 8 millennia at least. And the amount of grief I've taken over that's just crazy. Some of the people here know about some of that. So all I can tell you, Alejandro, is it's a noble goal. Your spiritual work will be your internal barometer regarding how and where you want to take that. But ultimately, you're going to have to get active in your community and in the real world.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bob. That was a great illustration of that. Thank you. Mr. Mark Stavish.
Well, one of the first things we published was a monograph called Wisdom's Bliss. And I always encourage folks to read that because you have to generate goodwill towards yourself and others and even your enemies. And the reason you need to generate goodwill towards your enemies is because sometimes you can convert them. It's not unheard of. Some people are opposed to you for various reasons that can be turned. And in those instances where they can't be because they are so diametrically opposed to you, at least then whatever does happen, happens to them with at least your best intentions, the best, how can I say, aspirations for them. I mean, I certainly don't want any of these suicide bombers to be killed. I don't want that to happen. I'd prefer they just not be suicide bombers. I prefer they have a better environment and better opportunity. But I have to want that for them too. And I have to in some way consider their well-being. Now, what happens is we've often taken that too far, and then we make excuses for some really bad behavior. And, in a personal relationship, they'll call that codependency. In the political environment, it's called, mass suicide. So you have to generate goodwill. But with that, you also have to generate what we call compassion, but not idiot compassion. Because the opposite side of that is courage and strength. So you have to be courageous, which is a nice way of saying you got to stop being a coward. And I'd use some stronger language than that, but I don't want to be rude or crude. So stop being a coward, which means you're going to take risks, and this is going to cost you. It's going to cost you a lot. And if you're not okay with that, stop pretending. Stop pretending you want to be spiritual. Stop pretending you want to be an adept. Stop pretending at all of it, and just go back and have a good life and do whatever you do. Invest in cryptos or, I don't know, do something else. But sell the books, get rid of the tools, and stop pretending. Because at some point, you're either all in or you're not. And I'm trying to tell you that if for what you want to do, what you're talking about here, there are magical operations which you can do that can affect things on a local level. And sometimes they're essential. But I'll tell you, they are not directed about policies, or should we say persons. Or even policies and platforms. They're about outcomes. You have to focus on outcomes. You can be a rabid anti-Nazi and think how great you are. Yeah, but you're just a totalitarian anyhow. You're just a Stalinist. You're not virtuous. It's all for the people. So this is where the generating goodwill comes in, because then you find the limits of your tolerance, the limits of your real generosity, the limits of your heart, the limits of your faith, and then how to build on that. And then you recognize that kindness alone isn't sufficient. How do I solve difficult problems while still being kind and strong? How do we balance out this kindness and strength? Geburah and Hesed, as we say in Kabbalah. And then how you do that is with wisdom in between. You've got to have some insight, genuine insight, not just a theory, but insight. And that's what wisdom is, from the inside out, a revelation of how to act. And that's going to mean getting involved. And that's going to be the guy who says yes and no. And, there's that picture that floats around And it's showing all these people at some Nazi rally because, you know, that's the only thing that we can have anymore. That's the only meme we can use. And they show the guy that sits there with his hands folded while everyone else is giving the Sig Heil salute, right? And they said, be this guy. You're not that guy. You're not going to be that guy. Again, if you don't support your own spiritual group or have $20 a year to do something, or can't go out and work a job or cut some grass to raise $20 to give to something, we call that karma yoga. Okay. Then you're not that guy. You're not going to put anything at risk until it's safe. That's why we saw so many in the spiritual community. The only thing they side with is the political view that's safe. It's mob mentality. It's mob creatures. But you can affect things magically on a local level. I know people who've done it quite well and quite effectively, and where there was some serious corruption involved, massive corruption, and they've helped bring that about. But there's repercussions. You're going against someone's gravy train. You know, you're getting between a hungry animal and its food. So you got to know what to do there. It's not a simple matter of I'm going to be safe from a distance. That's why even in the practices, you know, we'll call it tantric practices or other things, there's all these sort of protective things that are done. They're not done just for fun. They're done because they understand, you know, there's going to be a repercussion. You know, it's like going outside and turning on the fire hose. Not even the fire hose, just your garden hose. And, you know, you stand too close to your house and that brick wall or that siding, and you're going to get wet, like it or not. And even if you stay far enough away, the winds, or we'll call this the psychic energies, are going to carry some of that back to you because that's where you came from. So you got to get courage, take responsibility for something, and then go do it. And that's the only way you're going to bring it back, because that's your real spiritual work, not sitting on your cushion thinking about virtue. That's the planting the seed. Now you go cultivate it in the real world, and that hurts, and it's going to cost you a lot. And most of your spiritual friends are too cowardly to join you, and they're going to discourage you.
Yeah, this is a thing, right? You know, there are things happening that you know might mean to a person, and you know, being the person standing in the middle, being circled by a group of people that are all pointing and laughing and persecuting and humiliating or whatever it is, right? You're that guy in the middle, but you know you're right. You're like, hey, look, guys, look, you know, I sleep well at night knowing that I'm pretty well, you know, solid on what I'm saying here. I have a funny feeling there's a lot of people in that circle going, he's actually probably right, but man, I'm glad I'm not him. And this is something, you know, we've had to deal with quite recently as well, is that, you know, this missing word of no. Like, how confident are people at saying the word no? No, actually, no, sorry, no. And, you know, you might think you know what's right for my kids, but you know, I'm fairly confident that I'm actually, you know, I don't have children. I'm just saying, and you know, having the courage to do this, and that is something that we see being skewed somewhat through media, especially. This is something I follow because this is sort of my barometer in a ways of where things are going there, because I know how influential media is. And so, yeah, you know, having this, I think there's a great YouTube guy at the moment. It's called The Grim. He's like an ex-Russian mafia boss or something like this, and he talks about honor. And he brings such compelling conversation to it, you know, like, it's like, you know, where are things going if we don't really get solid with this? This is not an easy road. If you want to sleep well at night knowing that you did the right thing, you know, it's going to cost you essentially. And, you know, maybe it's the attitude towards this way of living. You know, if we want to change things, it's going to be a bit uncomfortable, and we're just going to have to deal with that. Now we're getting to the end here, but there is one question I really wanted to ask you guys, and Bob just touched on it, and that is this one here of the relationship between egregores and moral relativism, and this is where, you know, this is a more metaphysical view in the sense of like, well, if everyone's morally relativistic, over time, that's going to make it harder for the people who aren't morally relativistic. So there's this thing happening in the background that's subtle and nuanced, and most people won't be aware of, but they start getting this sort of feeling, or these messages come through of like, no, it's fine. And they're like, oh, I feel comforted by this. It doesn't feel right, but it does feel right. I'm not sure, like it's almost could be a confusing thing because it conflicts with their sort of own intrinsic principles and compasses and so forth. So, Bob, have you got something you can share on this?
Sure. Stalinism, socialism, human sacrifice, narcotics, they all have huge egregores surrounding them, just gigantic ones. And they rebadge every once in a while, too, as one thing comes in out of favor and comes back into favor again in human society. Again, the mechanics of this are absolute. They just work the way they do. As someone said earlier tonight, doesn't matter if you believe in gravity or not. If you step off the edge of a 5-story building, you're probably going to have a bad day. The egregores are real. They function just fine. When you understand the mechanics behind them and subtle energy, a whole lot of human behavior starts to make sense really quickly. And if you've ever seen someone break from an egregore, they quite literally go crazy for a little while. So, yeah, I'm sure there is a giant egregore out there centered around moral relativism and espousing and promoting that view. No question at all. Which is weird because you'd think, by definition, not believing anything would result in nothing. But not believing in anything is a religious view in and of itself. So you get an egregore. Yay. And, this is the reason why a lot of societies say, all right, something can be legal, like, say, cigarettes, but you're not allowed to promote it. Because if you don't promote it, it reduces the strength and efficacy of that egregore. They recognize it's a bad thing, but it's not such a bad thing that we're strictly going to outlaw it and deal with the ramifications of that. But you're not allowed to talk about it. You're not allowed to promote it. You're not allowed to push it on other people. There you go. Big picture, that's kind of how that stuff works.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. Great explanation. Mr. Mark Stavish.
Well, I think what he said. It's when you get a bunch of people together, they have certain beliefs, and from the metaphysical view, there's some intelligence or forces behind that somehow benefit from it. I think that the notion of what benefits from moral relativism is a certain amount of chaos and self-interest, selfishness, not self-interest, selfishness. And as a result, that's just a way of keeping people not journeying to the path because they're not that reflective on their life or their actions or the consequences. Or if they are on the path, and we'll put that in quotes, they're not going to get very far. It's going to all be sublunary for them, and that's fine. Okay, fine, but they're just food for the moon. And so some astral buffet, they're just part of the astral buffet. Know it or not. You don't have to believe in this stuff. I've given up trying to get people to understand it. You don't have to believe in it. It doesn't matter. It's still there.
Okay. Oops. Okay. Thank you for that. Yeah, these are important considerations for anyone who's getting into deeper work because, there's things that you might still be participating in that have been sort of imposed upon you socially that actually bear no actuality in the metaphysical realm. And so essentially you're holding or maintaining two contradicting points of view. And, Bob talks a lot about cognitive dissonance on the path and how that is a great, you're just making life hard for yourself because you're going to restrict your ability to move forward. And so you've got to resolve and reconcile these things within yourself. But if you're not aware of them, this is the part of why we take on the role of scribes and scholars and content creators and sharing this knowledge, and so that people become aware of it to go, I do all these good things, but crappy things keep happening to me. It's because maybe those things that you think are good are not actually good. And now we could go into a longer conversation about the little old lady that's never done a thing, put a foot out wrong out of place, but she keeps having bad things happen to her. But we probably won't have time to go into that. But I just wanted to say, let's tidy this up. And I want to say thank you, everyone in the chat, for joining us. Please see the YouTube description below for how you can connect and support the guests and the channel. Now, I want to just pass this to Mr. Bob Smith for his final words on the topic of, well, not what is moral relativism, but moral relativism. Bob, have you got any closing words on this topic?
Sure. And this doesn't apply to somebody who's 27 years into a 30-year pension. Don't quit your day job. Finish up. 4% of the U.S. public are entrepreneurs that support themselves based off that. If you really want to be free to make your own decisions, you have to be financially self-supporting so you're not dependent upon other people for your survival. So if you're young and you got a sound mind and a sound body, go out and become an entrepreneur. You're going to learn a lot about moral relativism in your business dealings real quick. You're going to learn a lot about people who are actually your friends and family members who actually care about you versus the ones who don't. But if you're smart and you work hard, in as little as 3 to 5 years, you can be free of those limitations on yourself, at least financially. And as a wiser man than me once said, free your mind and your ass will follow. I personally am impartial as to the series of events. But at the end of the day, you need to free both your mind and your ass if you actually want to be able to make real moral decisions governing how you want to live. So there you go.
Wonderful. Thank you. Final words on the topic of moral relativism for this presentation, Mr. Mark Stavish.
I'll just say what he said. It takes courage. Do the things that will give you the ability to make difficult decisions with the least damaging impact on you. And realize that if you're really attached to the impact this is going to have on you, then you're not on the path. You don't have enough detachment from this world to make an impact on it. You have to really be a true renunciant of the physical dimension, meaning that I like the world, I'm in it, I got some fun here, there's some good stuff going on, but it's not my ultimate reality or the total source of my essence of being or expression. So in that case, I'm willing to understand that, like, if you want power, it's going to be in direct proportion to your ability to experience pain. And that's it. And that means suffering. That's another word for suffering. How much can you put up with? And really, suddenly, you know what? This is that difficult. This isn't that hard. This doesn't matter. I've lost this. I've lost that. You know what? Did I really? It's okay. I can do that again, or I'll get more, whatever. And at the end, as I said to one fellow yesterday, hey, look, in the end, everything's ash. So I'm not going to get in a discussion over repatriation of human remains from secret societies because I don't care. It's not a moral question I care to spend any time on. It's irrelevant to me. I call that moralizing. And moralizing is when you take every little thing and you have to turn it into a moral issue to show how you're morally superior. That's probably the biggest thing about moral relativism that we haven't touched. Mm-hmm. No, everything's ash in the end. So just do your best. And you'll know you're doing your best when you experience some pain, because pain is really the fruits of your karmic actions. You've got stuff that you're unaware of that comes to fruition, but also so is the success and the freedom. That's what makes you free. So that's it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Now, as I always like to do, I like to give a plug for our guests to ensure that you can find their bodies of works to support them. Because like we said, all of a sudden, you might wake up one day and nothing's available, unless you know where to look. So first of all, I'm going to highlight the work of Mr. Mark Stavish here. And you have an upcoming course, or on the 24th of August, The Unknown Magus, an introduction to the life and works of Julius Evola. Would you like to give us a snapshot of what that's going to entail, Mr. Mark Stavish?
It's going to be a 3-week class by Dr. John White, a professor of philosophy, a member of our board. I like to describe him as the philosophy professor I wish I had. He's just a wonderful fellow who describes things and explains them in a great manner. And he's going to talk about the strengths and weaknesses of Evola and put him in a historical context so he's better understood, but also lead into some emphasis on what matters most, and that is the magical philosophy. And that magical philosophy we'd like to do more on later on what are called the 3 books of Introduction to Magic, which has to do with this notion of individuality and gaining personal freedom as drawn from classical and Renaissance sources.
Wonderful, thank you. And of course, there are many other courses available for Mark's, or the Institute for Hermetic Studies, Mark's works, available at the Teachable page, which I will provide a link for afterwards in the description below, so you can find those works. And there's many great things to explore here. Now, I also, of course, Mr. Bob Smith from 60 Skills, who has, in my view, one of the coolest lineups of just good stuff for those people on the path. He's even quite entertaining to watch on his videos and things like that. You have a very prolific presence on YouTube. You're really nailing it down. I'm seeing the entertainer come out a bit there, but tell us about anything impending coming up for 60 Skills, please, Bob.
Of course, www.60skills.com and the YouTube channel on 60 Skills Meditation. Like I said, the Zodiac course that I've been talking about for months should be coming out here sooner or later. There will be a basic version that anybody, regardless of their background, can approach. And so I think that will be very interesting for most people. Otherwise, as per usual, check out the webpage, check out the blog, check out YouTube, be entertained. And I'd love to hear from people. So thank you once again.
And I want to say a quick thank you, shout out to Violet Flame Studios for sponsoring the live streaming software this month. I'm very grateful. Please go and check out their website. They have some amazing depictions of esoteric knowledge and philosophies, basically gamified. They've got a whole new update area on the website you can go and explore and enjoy. And I want to say very much thank you to Bob and Mark for joining us today. It's always a great pleasure. You gentlemen are always very busy, and so I'm grateful for your time. And so I want to say thank you to everyone in the chat. Thank you to my wonderful guests. I'm even going to say thanks to me just for showing up and putting it all together. And no doubt we'll see you guys all again soon. Stay well. Have a beautiful week. Thank you so much.
Thank you.